Luzon, Philippines, August 20th, 1945. 13 days after Japan's surrender. The air inside the hut is damp with jungle heat. Flies buzz in lazy circles. Bamboo walls creak faintly in the breeze. Outside, American soldiers lean against trucks, smoking and murmuring. Inside, a young Japanese woman, no older than 25, sits on a rough wooden bench, legs folded, back rigid. She wears a faded khaki uniform. The red cross on her armband is smudged with ash and blood. Her name is Ishikawa. She had served as a combat nurse in the Japanese Imperial Army for 2 years. She surrendered 6 days ago, reluctantly, silently, without a word. Across from her sits a calm American officer. No weapon, no interrogation, only a file folder and a stack of photographs. One by one, he lays them out. A smiling woman in high heels and a satin dress, a Hollywood film star caught mid-laugh on a magazine cover. An American GI woman with rolled-up sleeves and a wrench in her hand. Ishikawa's eyes narrow. She blinks. The world she knew, emperor, duty, silence, self-sacrifice, doesn't align with the painted lips and open smiles before her. She isn't being tortured. She isn't being questioned. But something inside her is unraveling. By mid-1945, the Japanese Empire was collapsing. Across the Pacific, island by island, Allied forces had advanced with relentless pressure. From Guadalcanal to Saipan, from Leyte to Okinawa, the tide had turned. The Japanese Navy was shattered, cities were burning, and in a final act of devastation, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice, previously unheard by civilians, announced Japan's surrender. For a nation that had revered him as divine, it was an earthquake of the spirit. But in jungles, caves, and scattered command posts, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers and support personnel still waited. Among them were women. The role of Japanese women in the military is often overshadowed by the vast machinery of male conscription and Bushido sacrifice. But by the later stages of the war, Japan had quietly expanded its use of women in military roles, not as frontline combatants, but as vital support personnel. Army nurses served in frontline hospitals and aid stations across the Philippines, Burma, China, and Pacific outposts. Communication clerks and cipher operators were embedded in intelligence sections. Administrative staff, often drawn from educated women or students, handled logistics, translation, and supply coordination. Yoi! Some women were sent to occupied territories to serve in comfort stations, a euphemism for forced military brothels. Others volunteered or were coerced into morale services for troops. Though smaller in number than their Western counterparts, these women formed an essential part of Japan's stretched imperial apparatus, especially in the final desperate phase of the war. By 1944 to 45, many were stationed in places like Saipan, Guam, Okinawa, and the Philippines. Garrison islands where every inch of land became a battlefield. When the Allied offensives arrived, few of them were evacuated. Japanese doctrine held that surrender was dishonorable. For men, it often meant suicide. For women, it meant facing a different kind of death, one of shame. But by August 1945, the ideology had cracked. Medical teams, clerical units, and surviving civilian support staff began surrendering in small groups, many emaciated, exhausted, and mentally shattered. In the Philippines, U.S. forces reported the surrender of multiple female nursing units. Some had survived bombings. Others emerged from caves where they had been hiding with wounded soldiers. Their uniforms were ragged, their expressions vacant. In Saipan, American Marines found several female communication specialists living among the ruins of a former Japanese headquarters. One had not spoken for 3 days. In Okinawa, the carnage was greater. Japanese propaganda had warned civilians, especially women, that Americans would torture or rape them. Some women committed suicide. Others tried to kill their children. But those who survived and surrendered were sent to temporary holding camps, separated from men, processed by medical teams, and held for interrogation and potential repatriation. Estimates vary, but by war's end, several thousand Japanese women, some in uniform, others in paramilitary or support roles, were in Allied custody across the Pacific. These women were unprepared for surrender, not just logistically, but spiritually. The imperial military had drilled obedience to the point of death. The concept of being captured alive, especially by Americans considered devils in wartime propaganda, was unimaginable. Now they were prisoners. But the Americans didn't behave like the demons they'd been warned about. There was food, medical aid, showers, silence. And then something unexpected happened. They were not shown weapons. They were shown photographs. The United States did not treat Japanese female prisoners the way Imperial Japan had treated captured enemies. There were no mass executions, no forced suicides, no shame parades. Instead, U.S. military intelligence saw something different in these prisoners, something strategic. They weren't just bodies. They were minds shaped by propaganda, and minds could be reshaped. By late 1945, Allied forces had developed a series of psychological operations protocols especially aimed at high-risk groups: soldiers, youth indoctrinated by ultra-nationalist schools, and military-affiliated civilians. Among these, Japanese women in uniform presented a unique case. They had been raised in a society that revered the emperor as a living god. They had been taught to believe that the West was corrupt, decadent, and evil. American women, they were told, were promiscuous, masculine, and dishonorable. But now, in Allied custody, those teachings were being systematically dismantled. American officers, working alongside psychological warfare units, began to introduce elements of U.S. culture to selected Japanese prisoners, not as mockery, but as contrast. The goal was subtle: to create cognitive dissonance, to let the prisoners experience doubt, not by force, but by vision. At first, the images were simple: American women smiling on the street, magazine covers from Life, Harper's Bazaar, photoplay, still photos of female factory workers waving from assembly lines, Hollywood portraits, Rita Hayworth, Betty Grable, Katharine Hepburn. To American soldiers, these were unremarkable, commonplace, symbols of home. To captured Japanese women, they were unreal. The hair was loose and curled. The makeup was bold. The smiles were wide, too wide. The women's bodies weren't hidden by layers of linen or obedience. They looked free. In larger camps, particularly in Yokohama, Manila, and Saipan, the process was expanded. Portable projectors showed newsreels of American daily life, footage of girls at colleges, families at picnics, women driving cars, marching in factory uniforms during wartime production. To the American audience, these were innocuous clips. To the Japanese prisoners, they were alien and subversive. Several reports from Allied field officers noted the immediate effect. Female detainees showed confusion and visible distress when shown images of American women in leadership or mechanical roles. U.S. Military Psychological Profile, Yokohama Holding Unit, September 1945. One interrogation report from Saipan even recorded a Japanese nurse whispering, "But these women, they do not look ashamed." This was not an accident. American psychological warfare doctrine recognized that Japanese culture was deeply rooted in hierarchy, obedience, and visual conformity. By introducing alternative visual models, especially confident, liberated women, the goal was to plant a seed of doubt. This wasn't about gloating or mocking the defeated. It was about reprogramming a mindset that had sustained militarism, emperor worship, and self-erasure. Leaflets were printed, magazines were circulated, photographs of American nurses treating Japanese wounded were handed out. Books with illustrations of peaceful American suburbs and women-led charities made their way into controlled reading rooms. At the heart of it all, the message, "Your world is not the only world. Look at what exists outside it." What the Allies didn't expect was just how emotionally destabilizing these images would be for the prisoners. For some women, it ignited admiration, even envy. For others, it felt like betrayal of everything they'd been raised to believe. Some wept. Some refused to look. Others stared for hours, unable to look away. What no guard could do with a rifle, a single photograph of a woman in a silk gown with bright lipstick and a relaxed smile could achieve in seconds. Confusion. The American strategy had opened a new kind of warfare, not with weapons, but with glamour, freedom, and contradiction. And the women who had once knelt before the emperor now sat cross-legged in huts and barracks, staring at smiling strangers from a world they never knew existed. For the women who had spent their entire lives within the boundaries of Imperial Japan's social structure, the photographs were more than strange. They were offensive, confusing, fascinating, and, at times, painfully beautiful. To understand the shock these women felt, one must understand what they had been taught. In wartime Japan, the ideal woman was not loud or expressive. She was silent, obedient, loyal to her family and emperor, modest in appearance, and dignified in restraint. The educational curriculum for girls emphasized etiquette, housekeeping, child-rearing, and, above all, sacrifice. Even women in military service were expected to embody these values. Army nurses, for example, were not praised for skill, but for stoicism and devotion to the wounded. They were encouraged to die with the men they treated if necessary. A reflection of the Bushido-inspired wartime ethos that permeated every corner of life. A woman who survived was expected to carry shame, not pride. This worldview made certain Western values, especially visible self-expression, incomprehensible. So, when captured, Japanese women saw their first image of a Hollywood actress smiling at the camera, hair done in waves, wearing a shimmering gown with exposed shoulders. It was not merely unfamiliar, it was scandalous. And yet, it was difficult to look away. American propaganda units knew exactly what they were doing. Among the earliest items distributed to Japanese female detainees were fashion magazines and beauty advertisements. To the Allies, these were symbols of freedom and consumer abundance. To the prisoners, they were riddles. Red lipstick, eyeshadow, and manicured nails. In Japan, these were reserved for geisha or entertainers. For most women, they would have been socially taboo. Proper Japanese women wore white face powder, tied their hair, and avoided open displays of sensuality. Now they were seeing ordinary American women, mothers, workers, students, not just wearing makeup, but celebrating it. This wasn't just aesthetics, it was a cultural reversal. In one U.S. psychological report from the Yokohama Detention Center, an interpreter noted, "Female prisoner reacted to makeup photos by covering her mouth and bowing her head. When pressed, she whispered, 'These women, they do not fear being seen.'" There was no translation for what she had just experienced, but she had felt it. Perhaps the most disorienting imagery came not from glamour shots, but from photos of women in uniforms. American female pilots, nurses, factory workers, and even soldiers. To Japanese detainees, the very concept of a woman commanding authority, especially over men, was counter to everything they had learned. They saw images of female U.S. Army nurses directing entire hospital units, or Rosie the Riveter-style posters calling on women to join the war effort. These women were not passive symbols. They were agents of history. For a Japanese woman who had grown up being told her destiny was to serve, marry, and disappear into the shadow of her husband or nation, this was not merely provocative. It was existentially confusing. How could these women laugh? How could they wear trousers? How could they speak in public? And smile without shame? In a report from a Philippines holding camp, an American sergeant recorded, when shown a photo of a female B-17 mechanic, two of the prisoners murmured in disbelief. One asked, "Why would a woman do that? That is not for us." The other whispered, "But she looks happy." The most powerful effect wasn't always spoken. The American officers began to notice. After photo sessions, some women sat alone, staring at the ground. Others began sketching. Not traditional Japanese motifs, but Western-style hair, fashion, and faces. A few even attempted to recreate lipstick by mixing food dyes and crushed charcoal. This wasn't about vanity. It was a quiet crisis of identity. The images had fractured the internal compass that guided them. One moment, they clung to the emperor's silence. The next, they were imagining themselves in satin dresses, smiling without asking permission. Psychologists describe cultural shock not as a sudden explosion, but as a slow unraveling. The realization that the world you were taught to believe in was smaller than the one that actually exists. That's what was happening here. Not in mass, but in moments. As each woman sat holding a photo, trying to reconcile two irreconcilable realities. The world they had come from was ashes. The world they were being shown was confusing, alive, bright, and dangerous in a new way. They weren't being broken by force. They were being unraveled by contrast, and the unraveling had just begun. While the cultural dissonance of seeing Hollywood stars and American women in power left Japanese female prisoners emotionally shaken, the deeper objective was never simply to surprise them. This was part of a broader political and psychological operation, one shaped by the reality that Japan had surrendered not just militarily, but spiritually. And that spiritual vacuum, the Allies knew, could either be filled with regret or something new. During the war, Japanese citizens had been immersed in one of the most rigid propaganda environments in modern history. Schools, radio broadcasts, films, and public announcements repeated the same message. The emperor was divine. The West was decadent and cruel. Japan's destiny was sacred. Women's duty was to serve the nation, suffer in silence, and die with honor if needed. There was no exposure to alternative ideas. Hollywood films had been banned since the early 1930s. Western magazines were non-existent. American music was illegal. So when the war ended, U.S. officials realized they weren't just occupying a defeated country. They were disarming an entire belief system. And female prisoners, often younger, educated, and deeply indoctrinated, became key subjects in this effort. American psychologists, many of whom had studied cultural anthropology before the war, designed re-education programs that emphasized visual contrast over confrontation. They believed that seeing images of free women, of female choice and confidence would destabilize the internal logic of emperor-based patriarchy. And it did. Not all at once. But repeated exposure led to internal friction, and that friction opened the door for influence. Japan had been brought to its knees by firebombs and atom bombs. But the U.S. understood that the future would not be secured through force. It would be secured through soft power. And so, the occupation strategy under General Douglas MacArthur, who oversaw post-war governance, emphasized cultural exposure, democratic reform, and Americanization. Inside POW camps and processing centers, this strategy filtered into daily life. Alongside sanitation and nutrition improvements came English language posters, Western novels, American films subtitled in Japanese, photographs of smiling women attending college, driving cars, voting. It was not propaganda in the traditional sense. There were no commands, no slogans, just images of life as it could be, radically different from the world they had been trained to die for. For some detainees, this ignited resentment. For others, it became a quiet temptation. Perhaps the most shocking symbol of this ideological reversal was the female American soldier. Captured Japanese women, raised in a system where the male was supreme and the female silent, were now guarded, processed, and sometimes interrogated by uniformed women. American WACS, Women's Army Corps, nurses, and translators. They gave orders. They carried sidearms. They spoke with confidence. This was not only an inversion of the Japanese ideal, it was unthinkable. In several recorded testimonies from captured nurses and clerks, detainees admitted to feeling uneasy and confused when addressed by women in command positions. One wrote in her repatriation interview, "In our country, women do not speak first. In America, they seem to speak without fear. I do not know what this means." These moments were not simply about gender. They were about power. Who had it? Who used it? Who was allowed to own it? And for the prisoners, the answer had changed overnight. Beyond cultural confusion, these women faced something deeper: moral dislocation. They had been told that Americans were inhuman, that surrender would mean torture, abuse, possibly death. Yet in the camps, they were fed, clothed, treated for wounds, and shown images of American women not as whores or enemies, but as human, even joyful. It didn't make sense. This contradiction between indoctrination and reality created psychological rupture. Some detainees shut down emotionally. Others began to question not just the war, but everything that had led to it. The photo of a smiling film actress was not just a picture. It was a crack in the wall, a crack that asked, "What if everything you were told was wrong?" Allied reports from late 1945 and early 1946 note subtle shifts in behavior among certain female detainees. Some began asking for English lessons. Others requested to keep magazine pages. A few attempted to copy Western hairstyles, even without mirrors or tools. One Japanese nurse was found sketching a scene from a Life magazine. A mother and daughter walking through a garden in Ohio. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of awakening. Not loud, not coordinated, but profound. What the Japanese military could not defeat with flags and fire, it happened quietly. No speech, no orders, just a table, a stack of photos, and an interpreter who didn't quite know what to expect. In the U.S. field detention facility, Luzon Sector, September 1945, the war was over, but the occupation had just begun. Inside the female barracks, Japanese prisoners were seated in rows, most in plain military-issue clothing or repurposed nurse uniforms. Their hair was neatly tied, eyes down, hands folded. The American Psychological Operations Team had brought in a small batch of magazines and photos, freshly flown in from California. This wasn't for intelligence, it was for something else. They wanted to see what would happen. The first image laid on the table was a studio portrait of Rita Hayworth, smiling mid-laugh, her head thrown back, hair shining with soft curls and light. There was a pause. The woman across from it, a former communications clerk from Saipan, didn't react. She blinked once, then slowly leaned forward. Her hand, trembling slightly, touched the edge of the photograph, but didn't lift it. The next image was of an American woman piloting a small transport aircraft, her hair pinned, her uniform pressed, eyes narrowed against the sun. A third showed Betty Grable, legs crossed, bathing suit gleaming, a cheeky smile aimed squarely at the lens. Around the room, the prisoners began to whisper. Not in resistance, in confusion. Is this allowed? Is she real? Why is she not ashamed? The American translator noted the murmurings in his report. They were visibly affected. Not hysterical, but unsettled. Several refused to touch the images. Others stared for prolonged periods without speaking. One woman asked softly, "Is she a wife? Would a husband not object?" In Japanese culture, especially during the imperial era, eye contact, especially by women, was considered improper. Women were taught to look downward, to speak gently, to avoid drawing attention. But here were American women looking directly into the camera. Bold, expressive, without apology. That gaze pierced the room. It wasn't sexual, it wasn't aggressive, it was self-assured. It said, "I exist. I choose." For women raised to believe that silence was honor and modesty was strength, it was almost unbearable to look at, and yet impossible to look away. One nurse broke down crying. She had served in Burma, evacuated through craters and jungle, watched comrades die in air raids, and tended to shattered limbs in tents that collapsed under monsoon rains. She had never cried, not through the war, not through surrender. But now, with a photo of a smiling American movie star in her lap, tears ran silently down her cheeks. She couldn't explain it. Neither could the Americans watching her. Another woman, a cipher clerk from Okinawa, whispered to the translator, "I thought we were strong. But they are not weak either." What the photographs achieved in that room was not surrender. That had already happened. This was something deeper. A collapse not of national identity, but of personal certainty. In war, certainty is armor. These women had clung to belief in duty, emperor, and modesty like lifelines. They had lost family, homes, even language. But not belief. Until now. Because these photographs didn't ask them to obey. They asked them to compare. And in that comparison, a terrible realization emerged. Maybe they were never the enemy I was told they were. Maybe I am the one who doesn't understand the world. There were no mirrors in most Allied-run POW camps. Deliberately so. But in that hut, on that day, each photograph became a mirror of a different kind. They saw women not starving, not weeping, not kneeling. They saw joy, comfort, control, agency. And perhaps for the first time in their lives they wondered, could I live like that? No guards shouted. No guns were drawn. But the transformation was real. The enemy had not invaded their bodies. It had entered through their eyes. The hut fell quiet after the photographs were shown, not because the prisoners were indifferent, but because something unspoken had shifted. And no one yet had words for it. The images had been retrieved. The guards stepped back, but many of the women remained seated, eyes distant, postures slack. A kind of silent fracture had opened between the world they had known and the one they were being shown. Not through speeches or flags, but through expressions, lipstick, and body language. This was no longer about ideology, it was about self-perception. And when identity breaks, it does so quietly. The Japanese worldview that had shaped these women for decades was not just a belief, it was an identity system. They were taught who they were, women born to serve the emperor, daughters of Yamato, pure and dignified, silent strength in the home or behind the front, bound to modesty, sacrifice, and duty. Now they had been handed a mirror they did not ask for, and in it they saw not failure but difference, not sin but freedom, and that freedom terrified them. One camp interpreter at Yokohama later wrote, "After the image sessions, many detainees stopped participating in morning exercises. Some avoided speaking for days. One woman told me, "I do not know how to be myself anymore." The psychological conflict grew not just from shock, but from envy. Some prisoners began to admire what they had seen: the ease of expression, the visible confidence, the permission to exist publicly as a woman without shame or scolding. It stirred something deep and wordless, especially in the younger detainees. But admiration in this context brought with it a burden of guilt, because to admire the enemy, especially the enemy who had defeated you, was tantamount to betrayal. Not betrayal of nation, but betrayal of your own suffering. Could they admire the smiles of American women when their own comrades had died in caves? Could they long for painted lips when their sisters had flung themselves off cliffs in Okinawa rather than fall into Allied hands? These were not abstract questions. They were emotional collisions, unresolved and painful. Years later, a few surviving prisoners would recall those days in hushed interviews or unpublished letters. One former nurse, whose testimony was recorded in 1973 as part of a post-war memory project, wrote, "They gave me a photograph of a woman in a dress the color of cherry blossoms. Her teeth were white. Her eyes were not afraid. I took the photo and I folded it into my uniform. I did not tell the others. I do not know why I kept it, but I still have it." She had never told her family. She had never spoken the name of the woman in the photograph, but she had seen a future she was not allowed to live. This was the final wound of the war for many female prisoners. Not the bombs, not the hunger, not even the loss of comrades, but the loss of personal definition. They had been taught what honor meant, what a woman's place was, what it meant to serve, to obey, to sacrifice. And now, in the presence of images so ordinary to Americans, yet so revolutionary to them, they found that the instructions no longer applied. There was no template for who they were now. They weren't traitors, they weren't heroes, they were just suspended. By late 1945, Allied authorities began preparing to repatriate Japanese prisoners, including female detainees. Transport ships were scheduled, interrogations wrapped, camps were cleaned out, but something had changed. Reports from returning officers noted that many of the women went home quieter than they arrived, not broken, but dimmed. One interpreter noted, "They left with the same bodies, but different eyes," as if they had seen something they could not forget, but could never speak about. These women returned not just to a defeated country, but to a culture that had no language for what they had experienced, and in their silence lay a truth. They had survived the war, but they had lost the one thing they weren't prepared to lose: themselves. The war was over, but the silence had just begun. In the final weeks of 1945 and early 1946, American military authorities began the repatriation of Japanese prisoners of war, including the hundreds of women who had been captured across the Pacific. The process was slow, methodical, and impersonal. Their names were recorded. Their uniforms, if any remained, were confiscated. Each was issued a basic identification card, a travel voucher, and placed aboard repatriation ships, bound for a homeland that no longer resembled the one they had left. Most female prisoners were transported back to Yokohama, Hiroshima, or Fukuoka, depending on their point of origin and family registry. The voyages took weeks. On board, the mood was somber and restrained. These women were not returning heroes. They were not victims in the traditional sense, and they were certainly not celebrated. They were a reminder of a war that Japan wished to bury. Upon disembarkation, they passed through U.S. occupation checkpoints and were handed over to local authorities. But unlike the scrutiny directed at male veterans or known war criminals, these women were quietly released into society. Not because they were absolved, but because no one knew what to do with them. Their existence was an administrative inconvenience and a cultural contradiction. Japan in 1946 was not a place of healing. It was a landscape of burned cities, ration lines, and psychological numbness. Families were fragmented. Towns had been flattened by incendiary bombing. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were still reeling from the atomic shock. Food was scarce. Jobs were scarcer. Women returning from POW camps entered a society that had no framework for their experience. They had worn uniforms, yet were not soldiers. They had not fought, yet were seen as part of the regime. They had survived, and for that, some considered them suspect. In conservative towns, some women faced disownment. A few were refused marriage, their past seen as stained. Others hid their history entirely, telling no one, not their husbands, not their children. One former communications aide, interviewed anonymously decades later, said, "I told my family I had been in a hospital. I never said whose. I never spoke of America. I kept the photo, though, in the drawer, always hidden." Unlike other groups of wartime survivors, these women did not write memoirs in the decades that followed. No associations of returned female POWs were formed. No monuments were erected. No oral history projects were launched on their behalf. They simply disappeared into Japan's post-war silence, a silence that stretched for decades. Historians searching for their stories would later remark how painfully sparse the documentation was. The American military kept more records than the Japanese government, and even those records were clinical. Names, photos, fingerprints, transport logs, but the emotions, the fractures, the identities lost. Those were never written down, because these women were never supposed to exist in the first place. And so, when they returned, they became what they were trained to be: invisible. Their uniforms were gone. Their ranks were gone. Even their confusion had no audience. But the memory of a photograph, of a woman they never met, smiling on a page, remained like a whisper that followed them into peacetime, into marriage, into motherhood, into death. Unspoken, unclaimed, but never fully erased. The war was lost. The empire dissolved. The emperor was no longer divine. And yet, in the rubble of Japan's defeat, something new was growing, a transformation that would change the nation from within, slowly and irrevocably. Ironically, it began with the very images that once shocked Japanese women in Allied POW camps. After the formal surrender, the U.S. occupation force, led by General Douglas MacArthur, began one of the most ambitious political and cultural projects in modern history: to rebuild Japan not only as a peaceful state, but as a democracy aligned with Western values. Central to this effort was media. American films, music, magazines, and radio shows flooded the country. What had once been banned as enemy filth now became tools of reorientation, and the very images that once caused emotional dissonance for women in detention, the laughing actresses, the empowered factory workers, the confident female students, now appeared in theaters, shop windows, and translated magazines across Japan. In Tokyo's Ginza district, posters of Audrey Hepburn, Elizabeth Taylor, and Grace Kelly lit up cinemas. In record stores, American jazz and swing music played through cracked speakers. On magazine covers, Japanese models were styled in Western dresses and Hollywood curls. What had once been used as psychological contrast was now being adopted, voluntarily, enthusiastically, and en masse. For many post-war Japanese women, the collapse of the militarist ideal left a vacuum. The wartime identity of the self-sacrificing, invisible supporter no longer made sense in a world shaped by occupation, education reform, and economic desperation. The new identity offered by Western media was not without its contradictions. It was glamorous, yes, but it also promised something unspoken: choice. And in a country struggling to redefine itself, choice was a radical notion. Women began entering universities in greater numbers. Employment options slowly expanded beyond domestic work. A small but growing women's movement began challenging traditional gender roles. In 1946, Japan granted women the right to vote, a milestone that stunned older generations. Hollywood images did not cause these shifts, but they foreshadowed them. And for a few women, especially those who had seen the photos first, inside barbed wire, they may have accelerated the realization that a new kind of life was possible. The female POWs who had been shown those photographs in Allied camps rarely spoke publicly about what they saw. Most never admitted to family that they had been detained. Some denied ever interacting with Americans, but the images stayed with them. In 1991, a Japanese oral history project recorded the testimony of a retired schoolteacher, formerly a nurse captured in Luzon in 1945. She recalled, "We were told never to speak of our time in the camps. But I remember the photo. I remember the woman's smile. I had never seen a woman smile like that before. Not without permission. I never became like her, but I never forgot her either." She had kept the image hidden for nearly 50 years. The impact of the war was visible in Japan's shattered cities, but the impact of cultural contact, through photos, films, fashion, was far more subtle. It remapped the psyche, especially for women. In time, Japanese media would merge both influences. The demure traditional roles remained, but alongside them emerged a modern woman, fashionable, curious, increasingly public. TV dramas in the 1960s depicted women in careers. Magazines featured housewives and entrepreneurs. Pop stars wore eyeliner inspired not by Kyoto courtesans, but by Marilyn Monroe. The women who had once wept at the sight of a lipstick ad had helped, quietly, invisibly, to carry that influence back with them. And though their names were lost to silence, their eyes had seen the future of Japanese femininity before the rest of the country did. They were not warriors. They were not victims. They were something more fragile and more human. Witnesses, women who had walked through war believing in silence, sacrifice, and submission, and who, through a single photograph, saw a world that challenged everything they had been raised to believe. There were no bullets in those rooms, no interrogation lights, just glossy pages, film stills, and magazine clippings. And yet, the effect was devastating. What the Allied bombs had done to cities, these images did to certainty. Because sometimes surrender does not come at gunpoint. It comes when a woman who has never worn lipstick sees another woman smiling, head held high, with no shame, and realizes, "I was never told this was possible." That realization is not easy. It is not clean. It leaves no visible scars, but it changes you. And for those Japanese women, huddled behind camp walls, still clinging to duty and memory, it was a moment that rewrote their inner war. They returned to a Japan that wanted to forget, and so they forgot aloud. But somewhere, in drawers, in dreams, in quiet moments alone, those images remained. Not as propaganda, not as betrayal, but as the first glimpse of a different kind of power. One not built on conquest, but on freedom.